Welcome to the Creative Writing Career Podcast, where you learn how to make writing more than a hobby. Make it a career. And here are your hosts, Stephan, Justin Sloan, and Kevin Tumlinson.
Hi, everyone. This is the Creative Writing Careers Podcast. This is Stephan Bugai. I'm here with my co-hosts, Justin Sloan and Kevin Tumlinson. And today we're talking to Matt Ritter. Matt is a multiple medium writer. I had hired Matt at Telltale Games, where he worked on Walking Dead Season 2, Tales from the Borderlands, off the strength of the coverage that I got on his spec screenplays. And Matt is also a graphic novel writer, and he's written several excellent graphic novels, including Retropunk and Nova Phase, which I believe is now 2 volumes. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, it's 2 volumes.
Great. So Matt comes to us with experience in games, graphic novels, and spec screenwriting. He has a self-created game called Boon Hill, which is a graveyard simulator, which is fun if you like being depressed, which I do. So I enjoy it. It's an indie game, and in the interest of supporting indie writers, developers, publishers, and so on, I suggest that our listeners check it out. So without further ado, let's talk to Matt.
Hey, Matt, what's going on, man?
Not much. Trying to do PR for Boon Hill and get people to write about it and care about it, which is hard for an indie game, especially right now, as the market's a little proliferated, which isn't bad. I'm glad that everyone's coming out with great stuff. It just makes it hard to get anyone to care about any one thing. And then, of course, it's a graveyard simulator. So, people look at you weird when you say that, and they should, because it's a weird idea.
Awesome.
So, Matt, is Boon Hill on Steam?
Boon Hill's not on Steam yet. It's going to be on Steam on the 31st. It should, unless something goes wrong in our whole getting it approved on Steam, but it should be fine. Will be for sale on Steam on Halloween, because if you're going to buy a graveyard simulator, you might as well buy it on Halloween. That's just one of those things. If you want it right now, you can get it through the website, or just look up Boon Hill on Google, and you'll be able to find the main website, and there's a widget through Humble Bundle where you can purchase it. I believe the website is 14hoursproductions.com, which is the name of the studio, the small indie studio that made it, which is basically just me.
Great. So, if for our listeners, let's say people who want to wade into the sea of cool new indie games and perhaps put something together themselves, most of our listeners are writers primarily, and probably exclusively in terms of the creative arts. If they want to put together a game that involves a lot of different disciplines, there's the writing, but there's also the graphic art, there's the sound design, there's the programming. How would you recommend our listeners who are primarily writers who might be interested in that go about getting involved in creating or writing an indie game?
That is a very good question. That is perhaps the only really good question when it comes to making indie games. And everyone has to answer it differently. But if you are a writer that doesn't know anybody who programs or does art and stuff if you have all these other things you need done in your game and you don't know how to go about it, the first thing you should do is go to your community college and look up classes on programming. You take some of those classes, then you can meet people who program. You can start to learn how games are put together yourself, and hopefully start to network and build that foundation, because game writing and game design and game art, at the end of the day, none of it means anything if you can't put the code together. So that's where I would say to start. That's the best way. Even if you're and you don't necessarily have to learn to program yourself, but you should learn the basics. You should know, what a bit is. You should have some idea of the basics of some languages, and then you can meet other people who know way more than you. But if you have that foundation, you can talk to them. So if you end up being the director of the game, you at least know enough to not sound like an idiot talking to someone who knows way more than you.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in addition to community college classes, which are great because they're actually very cheap. And
yes, that's the main
and often very excellent. meetup groups as well, such
Oh,
as
yes.
if you're here in Los Angeles or most cities, there are game dev meetup groups. LA has a good Unity meetup group, and I'll drop another plug for Unity on this podcast since my friend Rob Pardo is their ombudsman currently, and I like to help my friends even when they're successful. And I think Unity is a really good platform for developing indie games, and there's a good community around it. And as Matt said, developing an indie game is all about building a community. So participating in a community around a platform that's already community oriented is going to give you a leg up. So I think those are some things that you can do if you are a writer interested in putting together an indie game, or getting involved in writing an indie game that someone else is putting together. It's all very community oriented.
Oh yeah. Another thing I might suggest is that if you're on the internet and you hear about some new indie game that's starting up and it sounds interesting and there doesn't seem to be a writer attached to the project, send them an email, because worst thing they're going to do is say no. But you'd actually be surprised. There's quite a few projects I've worked on where I was just like, this is really cool. Do you guys need any help doing just like random string writing or something? And sometimes they
Really?
say yes.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. So you're saying I actually thought it would be just the opposite of that. Like I always figured there's always the writer. Like somebody's always there writing this stuff. So
Well,
you're saying that it's more common the other way?
No, it's not that it's more common. There's almost always someone who has a creative vision, but more and more, a lot of people are coming to realize, and the industry is changing a little bit in this way, that if you're like the director or the programmer or the lead designer and you want the story to be really good, you don't always have the time to spend the focus on that you should. And so it feels more and more people are realizing if they want the story to be great, if they want the characters to come off, even if they consider themselves a good writer, they don't always have the focus for that. So more and more, we're actually getting teams where the writer is their own person, whereas in the past, traditionally, there's just been no writer. There's been like a designer and he did the writing, or there's been the lead programmer who also did the writing, which isn't always the best way to go about it for that reason. Just because if you're really busy and you have to spend all day designing, you can't necessarily then focus on the really important stuff narratively.
So how would someone go about finding those games? Like what's a good resource for people who might want to get into this, so that they could find people who might need writers?
Oh, that's hard. I know that there are some decent ones out there.
Okay.
I have actually been successful enough at it now that I'm not having trouble finding those things. But there's some forums and stuff where people will go and they're like, the internet version of meetup groups isn't a bad place. Just interesting like games and stuff you hear about, and not even necessarily just indie projects. You'd be surprised. People are generally very nice, and you can talk to small projects, and the people will respond. And even if they don't have anything, they'll be like, "Oh, but I heard about this over here," or it's as Stephan was saying, it's a lot about community, and everyone in the smaller end, they're all afraid they're not going to make it, so they want to be nice to you, because if later you're famous, they want a job.
Right.
And are these? Go ahead.
No, a follow up was would you look at like Kickstarter or just go to meetup.com or something like that and start looking for people?
Kickstarter is not a bad place to see what kind of things people are trying to do, even if you don't get anything from there. Dogs!
Bonus guess.
And we lost him, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, sorry. Kickstarter's not a bad place to look around. Places like Indiegogo and things like that. The night.
Let's try that again.
Yeah,
edit point.
This is like a 1980s Christmas album now. We've got dogs singing along.
All right. I think they're done. All right. So Kickstarter's not a bad place to look around. Indiegogo, other sites like that, because even you can get a look at small teams. You can see the kind of stuff they're putting together, and it's nice because you can instantly see how much people care about different projects. So that's interesting. And then normally, because it's all community based, there's a way to talk to those people. So even if you weren't going to get like jobs through that, it's definitely a good way to start networking, talking to people, getting advice. And it's all about community. And just because I forgot to mention it earlier, Unity is awesome. Boon Hill is made in Unity. It's absolutely amazing. Because
every time you guys talk about Unity, I'm this close to downloading it on my Mac. So keep
awesome.
talking it up.
Kevin, finish our novel first.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
exactly. One more project to.
Hey, on this topic, are those generally, would you expect to go into there and not get paid for something like this because it's building your resume and your experience, or do you get paid for that kind of stuff usually, Matt?
That I generally get paid, but until Stephan hired me, I generally did not. Sometimes I did, and I did a lot of freelance work for pay, but that was almost all pixel art. I used to be an artist in the games industry, actually, before Stephan was nice enough to hire me for my writing, and now people pay me to write. So thank you for that, like a lot.
You're welcome.
So what you're saying is it's good that I know Stephan now. If I want to,
I would think it's always good to know Stephan.
I thought that
flattery will get you everywhere. So, Matt, switching over to another medium for a moment, at least, graphic novels. You've done a bunch of those, and they've come out very well, at least the ones that I've seen. And so, for our readers, our readers, our listeners, who
reading, we could transcribe this.
That's true. We could speech to text. It'll be excellent. Pie microwave car hat. So
maybe somebody can volunteer for that. Write into us. Let us know.
I can't wait till we get to the dogs barking on the
well, now we can't edit that out, by the way. Okay.
Or it can be mysterious.
Yeah.
For listeners who might be interested in pursuing graphic novels or serialized comics, coming from the indie angle, not getting a job at Marvel or DC, which is not something you've done. What are the steps that you recommend that they take in terms of putting together the team, basically the writer and the artist? How many artists? With indie comics, it's often just two people. There's not a separate inker and penciler and colorist and letterer. And how to put that team together and make it work and make it something that both sides are getting something out of.
That's hard. That's really hard because, and I love comics, so what I'm going to say now is not meant to discourage anyone from making comics, but there's not a lot of money in comics. A lot of properties get taken and then get made into really financially successful stuff, but comics itself is a fairly small, even the big boys don't sell as much as you would think. Like last time I checked, and these are old stats, but last time I checked, Batman, the main Batman title, was like the best-selling comic in the world, and in the United States, it was moving like 100,000 copies a month, which for the best-selling comic in the world, that's actually pretty low if you think about it. But as for making a nice indie team, it's pretty much the exact, like the thing to do if you're making an indie game, if you're making an indie comic, is you have to make it, because that's the only way to get better at something. Until you've made a bunch of crap things, you can't make a good one. Like, of the graphic novels I've made, I had Stephan mention the ones that I hope people find. There are lots of comic stuff I've written I don't necessarily want anyone to find that you probably could if you looked hard enough. But you need to find people who can draw, and you need to either understand that you'll be working with someone who isn't necessarily the best artist in the world if you want them to work for free, or if you want someone who is of that quality, you may have to pay them, and that's just because it's a very, when people look at comic books, the first thing they're going to notice is the art. That's what's going to sell it. That's what's going to get people enthused and excited, and hopefully once they're excited, they read your amazing writing and they're like, this is the greatest thing ever. But you will not get them to read your writing unless the art is good. So like working with someone who isn't the best artist to help them practice and you practice, that's great. But if you want to start off with just kick-ass art, you'll have to pay somebody because they've spent, to get to that kick-ass art level, they've spent so much time practicing it that they're at that point where they can't work for free anymore because they've dumped hundreds of thousands of hours into trying to draw hands. And, you know, that's another one of those hard things. Like, how do you find those people? And it's the same sort of things. Go to comic meetups, go take classes, go look on the internet on like weird art places like DeviantArt and just message people who look like they'd be interested in comic art. It's the same sort of building community, trying to network and find people. Go to conventions. Actually, that is a great place to do it because they will always have artist alleys at most conventions, most nerd conventions and comic conventions and stuff. And you can go and you can look and talk to all these people making comics. And sometimes you might find an artist that either you could afford or that just is interested in doing stuff but doesn't know where to start with their own story. And then that's perfect for you because you're a writer, probably.
There's a bet. There's a sure bet there.
Yeah.
Odds are. On this show, at least.
Hey,
So,
go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to talk about Matt goes to Comic-Con and all these kind of conventions, you know, more than myself. And so what kind of advice do you have out there for our listener who wants to go to these things but hasn't really gotten into it? Like, what should they expect? What should they do to prep themselves? If they have something they're trying to sell, is that something they should expect? Are they able to sell things, or should they go more, you know, with something else in mind?
Well, if they're going to one of the big conventions, generally you don't sell something unless you have a booth. Like, you can talk about it, but you're not going to, like, you don't want, it's generally against the rules to like walk around with a bunch of copies of your comic and be like, this is $5. Because there are people who paid for space and things like that. And and if you're doing that, if you're setting up a booth, that's a whole thing. You want to have as much like cool stuff as you have. You want to understand that you may not be making your money back that you paid for the booth. It's about networking and meeting people and people coming up and trading like business cards. If you're just going to the convention, the main thing I would say to keep in mind anytime anyone goes to a convention is that you're hopefully not there to be a jerk and spend the whole time like talking about yourself in that weird networking way. Networking often comes much more effectively from just meeting a bunch of people and, you know, like going to the parties and just talking to people's booths about their own stuff. Because if you're interested in their stuff, they are often later interested in your stuff because they like you. I know that sounds kind of Machiavellian. I think I just pronounced his name wrong, but it's not because you build community, you network and you like other people and they like your stuff, and that's just humanity. So it's not being creepy or anything.
Silence is creepy, though.
Silence
So
Go ahead.
go ahead, Kevin. Kevin, go for it.
I'm just filling the space when I hear silence. That's all. I didn't have any prepared question. Go ahead, Stephan.
So, Matt, for our listeners who might be interested in game writing, but for a company, you know, I hired you at Telltale, but I didn't, you know, go out and seek jobs and end up with your job at Telltale. So if you could give some advice to our listeners who might be interested in becoming game writers for a company, not necessarily, you know, Telltale or one of, you know, 1,000 other game companies that are out there that need writers for different kinds of games. What approach did you take, and what do you recommend, and what did you try that didn't work in terms of pursuing that goal?
That is a great question. Well, first off, you want to make sure that your samples are together, they're organized, and you have a wide variety of samples. If you have like if we're going like script writing, and a lot of games places will want to see script format. From what I've seen and all the writing tests I've done, it's almost always in film script or TV script format. So you want some samples in that. And you preferably want samples on the shorter side. You want like a couple of scenes. You want short. You want like a half an hour TV show like spec, because people don't have a lot of time. And you have no idea how many submissions these places get. How many like Telltale submissions were you going through? Over 5,000, Stephan?
A large number. But I will say that for me personally, and this may not apply to all game companies, I would look at short samples to see if the person had even the vaguest grasp of the English language or drama or what anything should look like, and that would weight out 90%. But beyond that, to close the final mile, every single person that I hired, at least at Telltale, had to have at least one feature screenplay that went through coverage with 2 professional Hollywood readers and then 2 people in house. So, which was me and Kevin Bruner. So
Yeah, which is awesome from you. I will say that other places that have looked at my stuff have definitely not been interested in reading a full. Not that you shouldn't have a spec like full movie, because you should practice writing everything you can. Because games writing is just all over the place. You might be trying to write just a bunch of one-liners. You might be trying to write something very much like a movie but interactive, like what Telltale does. You might be asked just to tell a story through objects people pick up in the game. Like, you will not necessarily be able to predict the kind of work you might be getting. Or like, there's a game I'm working on right now called like Sea Wars, and what I'm doing is I'm taking translated Chinese and then rewriting it into English and then changing it so the narrative is better, and then they translate it back into Chinese for their own like for the Chinese version, because they've been liking the stuff I've been doing to it. And like, that's like, how do you prepare for that? That's weird. It's just crazy.
Well, rewriting is part of a lot of the writing profession. So actually, whether it's been translated from Chinese or, from terrible English to less terrible English, the job of rewriting is common in games and in films for sure. So
that's very true. That's the first thing I ever actually did at Telltale. That was the second week there. I was horrified. I just spent the entire time absolutely terrified.
Hey, Matt, on the writing sample part, so we talk about screenplays and short sample screenplays, and people ask me this question a lot, like what kind of samples they should be doing. Like, should they getting on Twine? Should they be doing some kind of video game sample? Maybe something they can do from their class or something? And also, I'd love to hear about writing tests and what your thoughts are, like what people should expect for writing tests when they apply for game jobs.
I hate writing tests, and you can expect that if someone is actually interested in you, they will expect you to do a large amount of writing for free, and that will never get used for anything other than to tell whether or not you're an idiot, and that is average. That is every other place. Stephan was actually one of the few people I met who did not do that, and is the moment he left, they started doing it again over at Telltale. Like, everyone wants like these huge writing samples, and they often are very frustrating because it's clear they want something very specific, and they don't always tell you what they want that is that specific thing. And so you can often get passed up for jobs you might be great for because you didn't write enough characters that were over 30 or something like that.
I can tell you that is universal. I mean, that's copywriting as well. So I get that all the time. If I haven't already written exactly what they're looking for, then there tends to be a sort of nose turning that happens. So that's pretty universal, I think, for freelancers.
Yeah. And as for stuff to make, I would say make a game that you think is interesting narratively, because people love people who have done ship titles of any kind, even if they're just, like shipped like through Steam Greenlight or something like that. If you have titles that have actually made it out onto the market, that always looks really good to producers who are looking to hire, because everyone's always afraid of someone who doesn't know how to finish a product. So
yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I will just put my 2 cents in there and say that writing tests are generally used by people who don't know anything about writing in order to try to assess writers.
Amen.
Because people who are professional writers, professional editors, professional producers, and so on, who've had a lot of interaction with writing, generally would rather see something that you've actually written yourself from start to finish, because it says a lot more about who you are as a writer and your abilities. So that's just my 2 cents about writing tests, because I think that they demonstrably give a false sense of whether or not you're going to be able to work well with that person. So I would recommend that people who are hiring writers, if they don't know how to read critically, pick up that skill, or contract with professional readers who have that skill to give them coverage. because I think it's better for everyone. Really, I think it ends up with better results overall.
I would agree with you, Stefan. The only thing that I think that a writing test might be useful for is it can sometimes be hard to tell, reading someone else's writing, if they would be able to match a new voice. And therefore, I could see a short writing test being like, write a scene between these two characters that we have an IP for, just so you can then read it and be like, oh yeah, they're close enough that we can teach them to do the voice easily. And that should not be, because most of the writing tests I've done, they're often these giant long things, and I'm like, you want me to spend 12 hours writing this thing you're never going to use, and you're probably only going to read half of, and it's just very frustrating. But if you want the job, you'll do it, and sometimes you'll get it, and sometimes you won't, and they won't even tell you why they didn't hire you, and you cry.
Well, if you're designing a writing test to try and determine if someone can match voice, you should give them a sample of the existing material. Too many people are like, here is a scenario, randomly come up with what your take on that would be, and assume that that's going to tell them anything about whether or not you can write for that IP, when the whole point of matching voice is, you get a TV Bible or a game Bible or previous episodes or whatever, and they're like, write it so it fits into that. And if you've never seen that before, you're just guessing. And they're not helping themselves determine whether or not they're finding the right people by, well, we're not going to tell you anything. We just want to see how you do. Well, that you might as well just read a sample.
Right. I will say there was a job recently I went for. I wrote a sample from people I knew inside the company. Everyone who read it apparently really loved it. The main issue was that I had not had any black characters. They didn't say that. Apparently, they used a word like urban at one point in the thing that I didn't pick up on or something. But they never outright said they wanted that. And that was apparently the main reason why I did not get hired.
Ridiculous.
That can be very offensive to the urban community.
I thought so. But that's why I'm not because they're good people, and it's a good company, and it's probably going to be a great game. So I'm not going to,
Well, it's not going to be as good as it could have been since they didn't.
Oh, of course, because they didn't hire me. That's.
My
so
question is, how do they know that you didn't write a black character?
That was actually my thoughts as well, because I did not mention. I think I said one character had red hair, but there was like 4 other characters, and I don't think any of that. Like that's it.
What do you mean? All the characters were black.
Yes. Hey, so Matt, you are now so successful. You're going to start your own company. This is me talking hypothetically, but you are awesome and you've done a lot of cool stuff. Let's say you do start your own company.
I have my own company.
Okay, cool. Let's say that you're looking to hire people, and somebody like Kevin is looking to apply in the next year. What do you think he could be doing between now and then to stand out and prepare himself?
Ooh, I'm interested in this question. Go ahead.
That would be making a really cool game. If I was, because that's probably what if Boon Hill does well enough, I hope to work on another game full time, because I'm currently doing a PR for another company that I wrote a game for. I guess Swords and Crossbones. It's out on Steam. I wrote that game. It's it's also a small game. They're not a huge company, but I'm now doing PR for them. And then I'm hoping to, I'm doing that part-time. And then in my other part-time, I'm hoping Boon Hill does well enough that I'll make another game. And if I was going to then hire for that game, assuming I have the money, make a cool little game that impresses me. And I will be like, hey, are you working on something right now that you're done with this game? And if you said no, I'd be like, well, I loved your writing. I loved your art. I loved your design. I loved the fact that you coded that in 2 weeks, whatever it is. And then I'd be like, yeah. Or if you were talking to me, showing me the game, and I'd be like, oh, you know how to make a game. You can actually make it. Yeah, I'll hire you.
Nice.
Yeah. So what are the chances of crossover, though? Like, okay, you do graphic novels, you do games, you've got a variety of things going on. So what are the chances are, because I do some work with I haven't done a graphic novel yet, but I've done some work with comic book writing in the past. So what are the chances that, you come across one of my comics or something and you say, that's a good story, or I like this guy's style, and I'm doing a game, maybe I'll bring that guy on. I mean, or I approach you and say, look, I'm not a game writer, but I have these comics or I have these novels. What are the chances of crossover in that?
The first one, probably not likely, because when I'm reading comics, I'm generally not thinking about games. And also comics are a very different sort of narrative form because they're incredibly linear. And I am often trying to make stuff that's like, if you played, like as Stephan said, Boon Hill is weird. Like there's no win scenario, there's no lose scenario, there's no direct narrative. It's just a weird sprawling graveyard. You go walk around the graveyard, you read graves. That's the entire game. And you learn about this town through reading them. I wouldn't necessarily be like, having read your awesome adventure comic, be like, that guy knows how to write epitaphs. I'm gonna hire that guy. But if you came to me and you said, I know how to write, and you showed me your comic book, I'd at least see that you knew how to finish something. And in my experience, there's a lot of people who want to write who don't know how to finish things. And if you don't know how to finish something, I don't know if I can work with you because I need to finish products. They have to get done. So that's to me, that's number one. If you can show me finished stuff, that is, I will like instantly be way more interested in working with you if you've got stuff that's done, as opposed to like, oh, I have these like half-finished short stories that are really cool. I don't want to read those because I can't
short stories.
Yeah,
I have these napkins. I started jotting things down.
Yeah. So there,
It's called
there
flash
can be,
fiction.
I have this page that says it was a dark and stormy night on it.
but there can be some crossover. Like am I forgetting his name? I cannot remember his name, but he was the lead artist on Braid, and he recently did a comic called Second Quest. I think it's called Second Quest. If I'm getting that wrong, I'm so sorry. It's a really good comic book, and he actually got in with a critic, like someone who wrote a bunch of critical essays, and they talked about how they felt about the narrative of Legend of Zelda, and how they felt like the recent Legend of Zeldas weren't like living up to it. And so this guy working in a video game like art and this guy doing critical essays did a comic book together. So that happens sometimes. Like it's not, crossover does totally happen.
Yeah, speaking of finishing things, guys. We're at the end of our time. Yeah. So right. Matt, do you have any last things to leave us with, or ways people can get a hold of you?
Okay, people can get a hold of me through the 14hoursproductions.com website. That's 14 hours with a 1 and a 4. And that's the name of my game company. And you should go play Boon Hill. The reviews are good so far. Like, so good that I'm like, what is wrong with you people? Like, this is a really weird game. But yeah, you can go read the reviews. You can read the really mean comment sections in the reviews, so you can get both sides of the story, and you can see whether or not it's a game for you.
Excellent. Cool. Anything else, guys?
That's it for me. I'm
Thanks,
checking
Matt.
out Boon Hill right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, do it. Check it out. All right. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and this has been the Creative Writing Career Podcast. Thank you, listener.
Thanks so much for listening to the Creative Writing Career Podcast with your hosts, Stephan Bugai, Justin Sloan, and Kevin Tumlinson. We'll catch you next time.